guess it helps if I turn the audio on. There we go. Huzzah. All right, now I'm in the wrong place again. Okay, you should be able to hear me now. Can you hear me now? I know you can. Okay, so, yeah, millennials, right? As I said last time, the internet becomes sort of a commercially available thing where consumers can buy access to the internet starting in around 1995. So most of them remember kind of at least the dawn of the internet, but they remember the internet being there for most of their lives. And if we're talking, right, our technology model of generations, this is without a doubt the generation that I would say is the first internet generation, right? Now the internet would have looked a little bit different for a lot of, well, I would say for the period where, where the millennials are in their kind of youth, you're largely talking about computers that are tethered to a wall, right? Desktop computers and early laptops. Wi-Fi sort of becomes popular once a good number of them have made it into adulthood. So it's a different experience of the internet. But again, we talked about millennials as being the first generation to experience social media. And they were, the earliest adopters of social media when they were kind of late teen, early adulthood. And they're, super educated, doing relatively well economically, though they often think they're not. Okay, and I think we ended with this, we ended with this slide. So I'll say, they have really high expectations in terms of lifestyle, probably owing to their baby boomer parents, the boomers being essentially the wealthiest generation we've ever seen. And they sort of expected their lives to roughly, be on par with their parents. And that's been difficult because of, high rising costs of living, high college debt, since more of them are educated. And we'll talk about education a little bit later in the course, but they need more education in order to sort of get started. Okay, and here's where we ended off, right? They're living a relatively slow life, though you can argue, they became, adolescents relatively early, right? Did not spell that right. I'm going to erase that. There we go. They became adolescents relatively early, right? They started having sex relatively early, but they're kind of years before they hit some of those life markers that we think of as those traditional transitions into full adulthood. Things like marriage, home ownership, have been relatively late, right? Especially stuff like marriage, right? For millennials, average age at first marriage was about 28 for women and about 30 for men. So they waited a long time to get married. One nice thing with the Surface Pen compared to the one that comes with my Dell laptop is I just touch it with the back and it erases things. So I can write and erase. It's super fun. Okay, so the other one I have to select the eraser down here and it's no fun at all. Okay, so lots of them probably are not going to get married, right? And we've also seen a decline in people living with romantic partners. So even cohabitation is kind of on the slide. A lot of people are just living alone, and they're having fewer children than any other generation. Now, this matters too, because when we talk about, Gen Z, and then, potentially Gen Alpha, or what sometimes people are calling the Polars. I don't like that one, but Gen Alpha. I don't like either of those names for a generation, but whatever. These cohorts are relatively small, and they're mostly the children of the millennials, because Gen Z now is just kind of getting into the period where they're having children. So most of the children currently alive today in Canada, the US, and other places are the children of the millennials. Okay. And yeah, relatively late age of mother at the birth of her first child. And I will note again, we see this kind of inversion, right? For the millennials, they're getting married at 28, and kind of age of child or age of the mother at first marriage is 27. So they're having children before they get married. Okay. So that is where we left off. A couple more things that are of interest. Relatively speaking, the millennials look like a pretty irreligious generation. We've seen the growth of a group that are called the nuns, right? And this is kind of this catch-all term that people have used. The nuns. Oops, that's not what I meant. I meant to highlight the nuns. So this is a term that's used in sociology of religion primarily to talk about a group of individuals who increasingly, when you ask them what their religion is, what they will tell you is it's, no religion, nothing, and sometimes nothing in particular. Ran out of space. Sometimes, within the nuns, you get, depending on who's asking, you get your atheists and agnostics. But they're generally people who are not engaged in religion. So you've seen, a growth in this particular group of people, the nuns, which I do think is very interesting. And I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get into our unit on, youth and religion. We'll talk a little bit about who the nuns are and what they look like. What I will say is, well, what should I say? I could say a great number of things, but what I will say is what the nuns are is probably people who in the past were marginally religious. You had a lot of marginal Christians, maybe marginal Jews and other religious groups as well, but mostly Christians that have sort of dropped that marginality, and they've sort of dropped out of religion. This is especially true amongst the working class, right? Working class has almost entirely, or if you look at it by education, people with a high school degree or less have almost completely fallen out of religion, leaving religion very much a sort of educated middle class sort of pursuit. Okay, there's so much I could say. I also teach the sociology of religion, winter 2025, where I talk a lot more about this and a lot more about the religious landscape. One of the things that is interesting, and I was just reading about this yesterday morning, is that, I guess, amongst other things, kind of weekly attendance. The percentage of weekly attenders amongst millennials, I guess, in the US is about 25%, and that largely has not gone down. However, everybody else, your people who attended less than weekly, several times a year, and seldom and never have almost, or seldom, have disappeared almost completely and gone to never and become nuns, right? But anyway, we'll talk about that more later in the course. The other thing we see with the millennials is increasingly kind of, what we would call this. Many of them are what we call cradle nuns, right? So rather than it being something where they decided, when they were 17, 18, 19, 20 to 25, that they were done with religion, a lot more of them were simply raised without religion, right? Their boomer and Gen X parents just raised them non-religious, right? So we're seeing a growing cohort of them that just have never been exposed to religion at all. Okay, now what do we see? Our charts are fun here, right? Percentage of US adults that ever pray. All right, we see the millennials, you take it's down roughly generation to generation, but it took a big dip with the millennials. Believe in God, a big dip again. Now, okay, so you're still at better than, 65%, but it's a lot less than your three previous generational cohorts. And ever attend religious services, right, was 75% for the boomers And now it's dropped below 65% for millennials, right? And Gen Z is not far behind in any of those categories. So religion seems to be on the wane when it comes to our most recent generational cohorts, millennials and Gen Z in particular. And again, we'll talk about that more a little bit later in the course. You're welcome. Okay. Said I'm having a day. Everything's dead and broken and all this stuff. Let's see if I can improve the audio quality. Apparently my microphone was dead. Turn that back on and try not to walk around too much. Or maybe. Hello? Oh, okay. There we go. That'll be better. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit more data about the millennials, right? We're going to tell you a little bit more about them. But here I'm going to be stepping away from Twenge, right? So we've been talking about Twenge and her two books, Generation Me and then Generations. And we're going to shift over to this big national study that was done in the US called the National Study of Youth and Religion. And for our purposes here, we're actually not going to talk about any of the religion components of it. We'll look at that a little bit later in the course. We're actually going to talk about the picture that they sort of painted of the millennials, because the National Study of Youth and Religion started doing its work in 2002 in the US, and they surveyed by phone 2,700 teens and their parents. So their initial cohort in 2002 was teenagers basically between 13 and then they went to about 22, at the max, right? Oh, sorry, not 20. I'm thinking of a different story. 13 and 18, right? So they started 13 to 18-year-olds in 2002 and their parents. And in the subsequent waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion, they revisited those same people, right? So they re-interviewed, these young people over that span of time. So you've got a good cross-section of American millennials in there, right? Because by 2002, your oldest millennials would have been, 22? But the bulk of the cohort, would have been in this kind of age range. So it's a really interesting study for getting a portrait of what the millennials look like. And one of the things that it did is it talked to them as teenagers. So 2002 to 2003, they did that first wave of research. They revisited them 5 years later, and then 5 years later again, and then 5 years later again. It ended up being 4 waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion to kind of trace them as they went from their teen years through all the way into their 30s, right? So they got a good sense of what the millennials were like. So this particular picture, that we'll be kind of drawing is going to be of the millennials between 2002 and 2007, right? So when they are in their teen and emerging adult years. So what were they like? Okay. So yeah, they started with 2,700 and 291 in-person, in-depth interviews, right? Done in, in the 48 contiguous U.S. states. Excluding Alaska and Hawaii, but the continental U.S., they did, all sorts of stuff in the continental U.S. Okay. Key figures, Christian Smith. We'll talk about him later. He's a big sociologist, and I'm a little bit of a fanboy. And then other people like Mark Rigneris, which we'll talk about. Mark used to show up once in the course, and now he shows up maybe 3 times. So I really like Mark's work overall. Okay. All right. Forward. Okay. So, all right. I have the waves there. So the millennials, as they were in 2010. And there were two books written, about the millennials kind of in their emerging adult years. One was Souls in Transition, about their religious life. And the other one is, I think it's called Lives in Transition, but now it's escaping me. Or Caught in Transition, about the millennials. Okay, so basically, in these two books, they sort of tried to paint a picture of the millennials as they were when they went through this particular period. So what had their lives kind of look like as, they graduated mostly from high school and gone off to college or into the workplace and all of these things. So it was a period, right? So late teen to emerge through the emerging adult years was a period mostly of a bunch of different transitions, right? They transitioned from a whole bunch of things, right? They moved out, they moved back in, they moved out again, right? So typically they moved out to go to college, moved back in after college, and maybe moved out again if they were able to sort of get their feet on the ground economically. Many of them, an increasing amount, especially compared to prior cohorts, went to university or college, and they lots of them took breaks, right? Went to college, found that what they were doing wasn't for them. Some of them graduated, some of them dropped out, some of them started down a career path, some of them, changed career paths. So lots of transitions there, and their parents, as they enter emerging adulthood, a lot of their parents go through separations and through the teens and emerging adult years, through separations and remarriages, right? And especially parents that had been, staying together for the kids. Well, once the kids move off to college, a lot of those relationships broke down. So in emerging adulthood, they experience kind of the breakdown of their parents' relationships. They took, obviously they take jobs, they quit jobs, they're transitioning through a lot of things, and they're moving, transitioning friend groups often multiple times. Right, so, especially leaving high school, right? And the way that American college works is typically a little bit different than Canadian. You move out, you finish high school, and you typically go to a college, and very often, right, especially for the sort of elites, you're not staying where your parents live. You're moving off to a college, usually somewhere else in the state, but sometimes in other parts of the country. It's a quirk of American culture that most people, to get the college experience, want to, live in the dorms, move out, move away from home. So you transition, from your high school friends to college friends, and then often back again, to your post-college friends, because, once you're done college, everybody kind of scatters. Many people go back to where they came from, or go off to get jobs in the big cities. All right, and lots of them go through, multiple relationship transitions of their own, beginning kind of, the experience of having romantic partners, getting together with people, maybe living with people, going through what you'd expect in the lives of emerging adults. Okay. So, what were they like? And again, in 2010, what were the millennials like? Well, they wanted to stand on their own 2 feet, probably, the millennials in a lot of ways at this period in their lives would have been kind of roughly where a lot of you are, right? Coming out, finishing university, coming out of university, trying to get jobs and all that stuff. So they want to, stand on their own 2 feet, but it is a continual challenge for them. This what we tend to think of as the standard Western script, right? So we can talk about social scripts, right? The typical Western social script, or at least the American one, I think the Canadian one's not too far off, is you go to, you graduate from high school, you go get a post-secondary education, and then once you have that, you're supposed to be transitioning, out from, from dependence on your parents to independence, right? You're supposed to be moving out. Moving out, getting your career in order, getting your career started, probably, starting to have, romantic partners and all of this stuff. But it is, they want to transition, but it's challenging mostly because of macroeconomic conditions. And especially for the millennials, 2008 and 2009 end up being this real inflection point, right? And because what you have is a global financial crisis. Without going into too much detail on the subprime lending crisis, basically, U.S. banks in particular, although British banks and a lot of European banks as well, had been giving out loans mostly to American home buyers that were called subprime. Basically, they were lending money to people who couldn't reasonably be expected to pay that money back. And that went about how you'd think it would go. As it goes in financial speak, it's like mortgages are really profitable, but eventually you run out of people to give mortgages to because mostly everybody who was going to have a mortgage, has one. And so you have this kind of slow trickle of people coming in who are buying houses, but it's slow. So how do you, increase the number of mortgages you pay out? Well, you give them to people with bad credit, at a higher risk. And then they do a bunch of shit. And this is partially, anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's supported by the U.S. federal government through these lending agencies called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, because the government names things stupid, apparently. So they lend a bunch of money, and then banks, seeing that they're going to get burned on this, they sell like insurance, or they buy insurance policies on it. And the whole thing in 2008, 2009 comes crumbling down when a lot of these mortgages come up for renewal and people haven't been making their payments, right? So the whole mortgage industry comes crashing down. And then you get, the collapse of a bunch of really big financial companies. It's really badly managed by the latter Bush administration. And the whole global economic system comes screeching to a halt. Lending virtually stops. It becomes much, much harder to get a loan. And so the economy really slows down, right? And it makes it really, really hard for millennials who are coming into the workplace at this point to get jobs. And this, the effects of this financial crisis last, somewhere between 7 and 8 years, right? It's a really long, slow burn of kind of repercussions to the global financial crisis. So millennials, they want to transition from dependence to independence. They want to get to the point where they can be independent, but they are struggling, right? Financially, they are struggling. Okay. They must have forgotten something in here. Okay, good times. No, excuse me. No, I'm sorry. Just come in, leave. There we go. Okay, so the other transition that they're going through, and again, you can probably relate because, this happened to you not that long ago, for most of you anyway, right? They go from this very secure structure of high school, right? Where, you're told where to be, you're told what to do, you're told you're going to be doing these classes, right? At least, and you're expected to be at school at this time, right? And your parents are probably still involved in your social life to some extent, right? Probably still paying for your extracurricular activities and all of these things, and structuring that time to a great extent to not so much, right? You go off to university and suddenly no one cares if you come to class. No one really cares if you pass your classes or not, other than you and hopefully whoever's paying for your, university education. But there's very little accountability. There's very little structure, right? If you don't want to show up to class, you don't, right? If you want to, you do, right? So it's a big transition, from a very managed life to a very unmanaged life, right? Like if you I guess if you miss school, right, and you're in high school, your parents are going to get a phone call. And now, my God, it's a phone call, it's a text message, and an email. When I was in high school and I skipped classes, all I had to make sure was that the cordless phone in our house was in the wrong part of the house, like, because they always would phone at dinner. So I would hide it like in the basement and be like, oh no, the phone's not here. I guess I'll go answer it. And now my kids will get away with nothing because it's like an email and a text message and a phone call, all three of these things. Their life kind of sucks. It's like, you skipped school. I know, because they sent me 17 messages about it. And then the very confusing moments for my daughter, especially, where they mark her as absent, and I know she's at school and she is at school, but like they pulled her out of class for some other activity, but marked her absent for some reason. I'm like, so you were skipping school? And she's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I got the text message. She's like, they're so dumb, and they are dumb. Anyway, it was much easier in my day to get away with things. Okay, so highly structured, right? People knew if you were skipping class. Obviously, in university, nobody cares, right? If you skip class, nobody cares. You might lose participation marks, but that's entirely up to you. There's not really, I'm not going to phone your parents if you don't come to class, because I don't have that information even. Also, I don't care. All right, host of new skills also need to be learned, right? All the adulting things, right? And actually, the millennials are, as they get on social media and hashtags are a thing, right? They come up with the term adulting. The task of doing adult things, like paying your bills, fixing things, like the air conditioning in your car, getting insurance, and romance, right? Navigating the complexities of romantic relationships, which for the millennials actually do get considerably more difficult because of cultural changes and things like, hookups, which make, knowing where you stand a lot more difficult, in terms of romance, because it's just, it becomes a much more casual culture with regards to romance, but it's one that's much more ambiguous as well. And they don't have enough money. And most emerging adults feel broke and are living paycheck to paycheck because you're at the kind of bottom end of the income scale and you have a lot of costs. All right. Now, probably the thing that's going to set our millennials apart, both from Gen X and from Gen Z, is their optimism, right? Gen X is super pessimistic, and it's maybe a function of, having grown up during those waning days of the Cold War, where nuclear Armageddon hovered over you every single day. I don't know. They were very pessimistic, and Gen Z, in a lot of ways, is fairly pessimistic as well. The millennials grow up in this kind of really weird bubble of a world. And if you want to, sort of get a sense of why millennials are a little salty right now, is because they kind of grew up in this magic moment, relative global peace and prosperity. And now, as they're entering middle age, all that is being yanked away from them. So, it's the post-Cold War, right? Our oldest millennials are 11, right? Our oldest millennials are 11 years old when the USSR goes kaput, right? When the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, our oldest millennials are 11, right? When they were 9, they saw the Berlin Wall come down, right? And Germany become reunified. And the period that follows through the 1990s and into the 2000s, prior to the global financial crisis, is one, sometimes referred to as the Pax Americana, or it's called the Peace of America, right? A kind of global order that's relatively harmonious. America is the only superpower out there. And there's a couple of, small wars here and there, but there's no big global conflagrations. And there's no sense of like superpowers being on the edge of a potential conflict, right? So it's a very peaceful period, and it's one of like huge economic prosperity. Through the 90s, growth is booming. Especially you have like the tech bubble, right? Or the growth of the internet economy really shines through. There's a bit of a hiccup at the end of the 1990s, but through most of the 2000s, right, there's a lot of prosperity. Okay, so the millennials are very optimistic, and they're told, the future seems bright. There's this sense that maybe we're in the end of history where, finally all the promises of progress and limitless prosperity are going to be realized. Okay, so very, very optimistic, and they think that the future is bright. In 2010, right, they're aware they're not exactly where they'd like to be, but they think that they will get there, right? And as we see, the millennials have done okay economically. Now, less typically, there is some subset of millennials who know that the normal frame of mind for people their age is to be optimistic, but they struggle to be optimistic, right? Often because their lives haven't been as blessed as some of their cohort. But on the whole, right, that's a minority position. Most millennials are quite optimistic. Now, they are optimistic, according to Smith and Snell, despite the fact that they have lived through stuff, right? It's not all sunshines and rainbows for the millennials, right? They have dealt with their own or more often their parents' alcoholism and drug use. And if you recall, right, when we were talking about the boomers, especially our white working class boomers, as they enter middle age, they start to have drug problems, right? Especially synthetic opioids, but a lot of alcoholism as well. That this is our deaths of despair. So, they've had to deal with alcoholism and drug use, as I said, mostly their parents. Some sexual exploitation, right? There's definitely sexual exploitation there. But probably, things like divorces of their parents, because they mostly didn't get married through this period. There are a lot of parental breakdown, right? Our boomers and our Gen Xers are the generations that hit that divorce kind of wave, and you see massive divorce through those two cohorts. So the millennials see a lot of their parents' generation, getting divorced. And I remember, growing up, and again, I'm sort of on the early end of the millennials. I remember in my friend group being the odd one out because my parents were actually still married, and most of my friends' parents were all divorced. So, I'm trying to think back, and I'm like, who was I friends with? I'm like, I think I had one other friend whose parents were still married, and I was kind of the odd one out. Okay, weirdly, he still works for his dad's company, even now. He is also bald, so we're good friends. We vibe on how jealous we are of people with hair. Okay, relational betrayals, right? As they enter kind of emerging adulthood, right, you get, the presence of hookup culture plays a role in this, but you get, cheating, breakups, and all of those relationship betrayals, friendships that break down, and all sorts of things like this. So relationship breakdowns over all sorts of stuff. They also have accidents, especially automobile accidents are pretty common. Academic and job kind of failures. Lots of people go to college and then sort of flunk out or don't get into the programs they wanted, or all of these sorts of things, right? Some of them, deal with parental abandonment. Not a majority, right? But certainly a percentage. Racism, we obviously know about this. And then, death of friends. And again, especially, as they go through their 20s, you do have, drug poisoning becoming an increasing problem. Or sometimes referred to as overdoses. Okay, so the millennials, like every generation, have their share of difficult experiences, but for whatever reason, right, they believe both in themselves and in their future. Okay, no regrets. No regrets. That said, the millennials, when we talk about them as a cohort, because of that optimism, they're very forward-looking. And they have a really, I think, interesting kind of way of thinking of hardships, right? So when you talk about regrets, you're talking about a reaction to hardship. And the millennials have this very interesting relationship to hardships, right? Those things that kind of happened to them in the past, they view them through this really interesting lens, right? And Smith will say, right, that they have this no regrets philosophy. They don't dwell on things. And what they say is that, some kind of combination of hard experiences are part of discovering who you are. I'm going to highlight this. And so those experiences made you who you are or helped you to discovering yourself. And the negative, right? Anything bad that happened to you in your past is always framed as helping people become who they are. So you have no regrets about your past if you're a millennial, because those were your formative experiences, right? And what Smith says, right, is that they seem to, that admitting to having regrets is the equivalent of capitulating to self-doubt, right? If you said you regret something, that would be the equivalent of giving into your self-doubts and somehow, out of step with that, inherent optimism of the generation. Okay, so, no regrets puts a sunny face on difficult matters and keeps life going forward, right, towards whatever millennials are aiming for. Okay. Oh, interesting question. Okay, those are two interesting questions. Okay, so social scripts. Maybe I will. Do I have a? No, I don't want to do that. Okay, so a social script, right? It's an interesting question. Social scripts are basically our understanding of what you should do based on what's going on in society, right? So, amongst other things, right? And we'll talk about social scripts because teenagers and young people have a lot of social scripts, a lot of things that they sort of inherit from the world around them. So, there's likely, let me think if I could think of a good social script here. All right, because we're talking about, life transitions, should you go to college or university? Now, for most people, I would say this isn't really a choice, right? It's actually just what you do, right? It's like what does your progression through life look like? Well, you're a kid, and then junior high, high school, and then you're going to go to university or college because you have to, and it's not really a question for a lot of people. Or, hey, here's a good one. Think of our, let's see if I can find my mouse, and I'll go backwards in time to answer your social script question. Way back in time to the silence, right? Why did the silence get married young, right? Well, everyone else was doing it. It was the normal understanding of what you did with your life, right? That you would meet someone in college or high school and you would get married to that person. So you followed that social script. When you're in, if you were silent, when you were in university or high school, you were looking for a romantic partner that you could marry, because that was the social understanding of just what you do, right? How do you progress through life? Well, the next thing after, graduating from your education is to get married and start a family. And so that's what you do. And most people just kind of follow the basic script. Now, these scripts can change, right? Because obviously, if we're talking about, say, the people in this room, this is going to be a tiny minority of people in this room who are going to get married, right out of university or out of high school. Well, obviously not out of high school unless you're already married. It's a really small percentage because that social script has changed, right? Today, it's much more like, okay, you graduate high school, you go to university, you get your job, you buy a house, and then, or I guess you travel, you discover yourself, you discover you, and then, as a capstone to it all, then you get married, right? So we have a very different social script of what it means to move through kind of your life today than, say, the silence did. And I would say, like, most people sort of go through this without really thinking. And you'll know that you're kind of in a weird place in terms of social script. Probably because when someone does something, like get married at 22 right out of university, you'll do a bit of a double take because you're like, oh, I mean, you didn't want to travel and, discover yourself or any of those things, right? You two didn't want to get your careers set up before you got married. You didn't want to cohabitate. I guess I forgot cohabit on here. It's probably somewhere after travel and discovering yourself. Okay, anyway, right? These are kind of scripts that most people follow. And why do you do it that way? Just because most people do, right? And most of the people within your particular social circle are going to be doing it. Okay. Now I must go back to the future. Oh, that's a beautiful little stack of Q&A slides. I like it. It's so beautiful. And the millennials ruin everything. Okay, there you go. It's what we do. Okay. Where was I? Okay, I'm here. Haha. All right. So yeah, social norms, are they different from social norms? Yeah, I mean, a script is going to tell you how to, pursue particular actions, right? A norm is more kind of like what people consider right and wrong, normal, abnormal, deviant versus non-deviant. So they're slightly different. The script is like you follow this, through your life. And we have a lot of these, right? Like you can put a whole bunch of social scripts in all sorts of areas of life. Okay, did the millennials inherit their optimism from the boomers and Gen Z inherit their pessimism from Gen X? I mean, maybe. That's a reasonable thesis, I think. The boomers, in a lot of ways, the boomers were much more like self-discovery oriented. So if anything, I think the millennials might have inherited their narcissism. And maybe that optimism is actually a function of narcissism, right? Because you think you're so special and wonderful that everything's just going to turn out for you. So that's possible. Is having kids because everyone else, your kids are having kids. Now, okay, so what almost inevitably happens is people will have kids at roughly the same time. And this can be a function of people following social scripts, right? Because, I mean, roughly speaking, you're all going to be moving through life at roughly the same pace because you're all kind of following the same kind of social norms, right? Or sorry, social scripts, right? It's like you're graduating from university, working for a bit, traveling, getting to know yourself, moving through kind of hookups and casual relationships towards something more serious, getting the job, getting the house, and all of that. And then you're all going to kind of hit around 26 to 35, where you've accomplished those things and you've probably found that person to get married to, maybe, increasingly less so, but that's a talk for another unit, and having kids at that point, right? So typically, yeah, people are following a social script that leads them to having kids at the same time, roughly speaking. There's also other social forces at work. I'm trying to remember what they call it, and it's escaping me at the moment. But once your really close friends start having children, and this is more true for women than it is for men a little bit, but things like if your sister gets pregnant, your chances of having a child within a year are roughly doubled, right? Because you kind of you tend to be like, yeah, I don't know, it triggers something in your brain. It's like, uh-oh, the tribe is reproducing. Time for me to join the tribe in reproduction or something. Because we're, at the end of the day, we still have monkey brains in some ways, right? So, especially when your close female relatives start having kids, it's like, it is the time. I don't know. It's weird. So there's other social forces, really close friends. It's the same thing. If they start having kids, you will tend to move in that direction as well. So it can travel sort of through kind of social groups, right? And social groups will organize this a little bit differently. If you're more religious, chances it's going to happen a little bit earlier. If you're less religious, probably a little bit later. But yeah, it's that one. It can be social scripts, and I think it follows social scripts in major ways. But then there's sometimes some kind of other social components where a group of people start to have children, and they all kind of move together in that action. Okay. That's not to say, right, if your sister gets pregnant that you're going to have a child within a year. It's just that your odds are about double. That doesn't mean 100%. Okay. All right. I don't know if you can see this on your slide because I don't know if I renewed it. But if you can log into the Slido and just answer this, because I want to see how much like a millennial you are. Because I want to ask, is it immoral to cheat on a test even if you know you won't get caught? And I think I set this up properly, and if I didn't, I apologize. I should test it. If my computer hadn't broken, it was my plan to test it. Now my phone is all buzzy because I touched it. Oh, of course. Be slow, Wi-Fi. I think I need a new phone. Oh, I can vote on it. Okay. I will let you vote for it. All right. So what do you think about this? How much like a millennial are you? How many of you are saying that just because I'm here? And you're like, oh, of course, we don't want you to think that we would ever cheat on a test. None of us would ever use ChatGPT to answer your amazing short answer questions. We are not like that at all. We are good. Okay. All right. I'll give it another second. Only 8% of you disagree that it's immoral to cheat on a test, even if you know you won't get caught. Well, that's good to hear. Only 16% ambiguous. Okay. Oops. Did those numbers change on me? No. All right. So we'll talk about that in a second because I'm just kind of curious, and we'll talk about how we know what's right or wrong. I'll say a couple words about parents, which I think I meant to move that slide. In emerging adulthood, right? Generally speaking, relationships with parents get better. You may have noticed this, right? As you entered emerging adulthood, a lot of you will have noticed your own relationships with your parents probably got better. And that's pretty normal, right? And this is driven by the fact that parents tend to loosen their grip on emerging adults, right? Because they consider them adults. They start to treat them more like adults. They treat that relationship as more adult to adult than adult to child. And this improves the quality of their relationship. Now, most people have a good relationship with their parents to start with, and this is pretty normal, right? It is probably your most significant life relationship is the one with your parents. So most people tend to do, move heaven and earth, as it were, to keep a good relationship with their parents. So the good news is, for most people, you have a good relationship with your parents, and it gets even better as you move into emerging adulthood. But a significant minority will still have ongoing problems with their parents. So it's not all fun and games. Okay, more voting. Actually, this is not voting. This is what do we call it? Enter a word. How do you know what is right and what is wrong? Where does your sense of morality come from? I'm curious. This is always a fun one. The voice in your head. I'm a little scared. Religion, integrity, the law. Okay. People's reaction. That's an interesting one. Intuition. You're taught by your parents. Context. Worked. Oh, something worked. Ooh, depending on the situation, it changes. Interesting. Gut feeling. Okay. Honesty, empathy, personal values. Parents, I guess. I don't know. I haven't thought of this. Oh my God. Okay. That's why, in sociology of youth, we ask the really tough questions. Like, how do you know what's right or wrong? I don't know if anyone else is still typing. Okay. I don't know what considering. I don't know. Okay. Interesting. All right. So this is interesting, right? These interesting results. And you can kind of see, parents are there a couple of times, right? If I want it to happen to you, so kind of like a golden rule-y type of argument, by taking sociology classes, can I just say that is a terrible way to know what's right and wrong. I would recommend not doing sociology. If you want to know what's right and wrong, I would suggest a philosophy class would be a much better place to do that. Way too many Marxists in sociology for you to be taking moral advice from us. Okay, yeah. I noticed all the fun join the Youth Communist League posters around, which, I have thoughts. Why do I have thoughts? I don't know. I just do. Okay, prof. All right. Yeah, hopefully not a sociology prof. Your philosophy prof is a much better place to turn for morality, kind of. I mean, unless there are certain schools of philosophy I also wouldn't recommend you following. Oh, guilt. Guilt is an interesting one. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about this a little bit. So, most millennials, and see, I have the word postmodern in neon letters, and I want to point that out because the graphic here is actually quite meaningful. What Smith and Snell suggest in their book is that most of our emerging adults will never have read Foucault. They will never have read Derrida. They probably have never read Nietzsche. And yet, all of these people kind of loom large in their moral thinking, right? They've essentially sort of adopted the sort of postmodern moral ethics of these types of thinkers. And you could include a lot of other thinkers in that list. I just kind of always think of Foucault, Derrida, and Nietzsche as the foundations of a kind of postmodern ethic. And one of the things you see, right, most millennials at this phase, and I think this is very much carried through with the millennials, don't really believe in the possibility of objective truth, right? They view themselves as being limited to their own perspectives, right? So you can only know your own perspective. And you could not have a more Derridian or Derrida type understanding of the world than this, right? This is, a thought and an idea straight out of Jacques Derrida. You go find it in, his book, The Truth in Painting. It's actually a really interesting book, even if Derrida is, I think, functionally insane at most points in his career. Not a big Derrida fan. I had to read way too much of it. Okay. So his big book, it's about that thick, it's called Of Grammatology. And I had a student one time being like, I really want to read Of Grammatology. And I was like, no, you really don't want to read Of Grammatology. I've read Of Grammatology and it is miserable. Don't do that. Okay. So they're not sure objective truth can ever be discovered, right? Because they're not sure that objective truth really exists, right? Everything is kind of subjective. And I love these because sometimes you get these things. We'll see this at least once more in the course where, you as the researcher, and this is always fun, pose a question to your participants. And you create it, you think this question makes sense, what actually comes out is that your participants don't understand what you're talking about and cannot seem to answer the question. And basically, when the interviewers for the National Study of Youth and Religion tried to ask whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities, or simply relative human inventions, many, if not most, of the participants, they said, weren't exactly sure what the interviewer was asking, right? The idea, and especially on this part, right? The objection that morality is based on some kind of universal quality or objective quality didn't really make sense, right? What would that even mean? And where would that come from? Was something they just didn't understand. Okay. And I love this quote, right? So this is from the Smith and Snell book. It seems they cannot, for whatever reason, believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, reality, or nature of the world that is, I wanted my highlighter back, independent of their subjective self-experience, and that in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change, right? So this is, I think, and again, I don't want to overstress this, this is very much what you would call a postmodern kind of understanding, right? Because it comes right out of people like Foucault, right? And so if you've had the pleasure, I assume, of taking some kind of contemporary social theory, right, you've probably encountered Foucault in some way, right? And for Foucault, right, and people before him, like Nietzsche is like this, and Foucault takes a lot from Nietzsche. Derrida is certainly like this. Deleuze and Guattari are basically Foucault, but if Foucault just spent all of his time doing mushrooms. If you ever read On a Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari, you'll understand what I mean. They talk a lot about rhizomes, which are like plants that can grow from any part of the root, and they think ideas are rhizomes. It's very trippy. It probably helps if you're stoned when you read it. My problem was probably I wasn't. Okay, so the postmodern, right? This idea of no objective truth, right? That we're locked into our own subjective positions are sort of givens of a postmodern philosophical tradition. And again, what Smith and Snell will suggest is that even though most millennials will never actually read the texts on which this is based, that philosophy has infiltrated the culture to such an extent that it is their kind of common sense, right? They are so deeply inculcated in it that they accept this notion that there are no objective moral facts, for example. They take that for granted, right? That's just, I always want to say the soup they swim in, and then I realized that people don't swim in soup. It's just the water they swim in. I don't know why I always get that one mixed up. Okay, so morality. Right and wrong are easy to discern, right? So when it comes to morality, despite the fact that at the end of the day, they essentially say there's no objective moral facts out there, morality is relatively easy to figure out. It is common sense. And how do you, and I love that back on here, right? Someone said intuition, because that's a very millennially kind of way of thinking, right? Feelings, if it feels right or wrong, intuition within themselves, right? Those are really common things. Implanted in them when they were children by parents or teachers, right? So it's social, it's passed down, and they view thinking and living morally as relatively effortless, right? It's easy. You just, okay, I'll put it this way, and maybe we'll come back to this later in the course. Actually, we will. I know we will. The way they tend to frame it in interviews is how do you live morally is this, right? And it's as simple as that. Be a good, kind, and decent person. Don't be an a-hole, and you should be fine, right? So, That is the way millennials tended to frame morality. Okay, what time is it? Maybe we are the narcissistic generation. I've just spent, almost half the class talking about my own generation. There we go. Good job, me. Okay, one of the core moral imperatives for millennials is do no harm, right? And what Smith and Snell say, and I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to highlight it because it's important, that they, millennials are at their core moral consequentialists, right? And so again, if I go back a couple of slides here, moral consequentialist, something like if I would want it to happen to me, that's a consequentialist kind of ethics. If you feel guilty about doing it, right, that's a consequentialist kind of ethics. And there was another one. Oh, depending on the situation, it changes. That is a very consequentialist kind of ethics. Okay, so what is consequentialist ethics? So an action is only immoral if it harms someone else, right? So would it be wrong to cheat on a test? I'm very pleased that you all said it would be. That's wonderful. You're lovely people. You're so much better than the millennials. But it might not be, wrong according to millennial kind of thinking and what they found in the study. It might not be wrong to cheat on a test if it doesn't harm anyone else, right? So if the class is curved and you cheating and getting a better result would harm other people in the class, maybe that would be wrong. But if it doesn't hurt anyone else, maybe not, right? Now, I always find this one interesting. Why hurting others was morally wrong was something that the millennials struggled to articulate, right? And I'm gonna highlight this because I just think it's brilliant. Not hurting others is a free-floating, unjustified supposition, right? They can't actually justify, why hurting people is bad. And you see this a lot, in people's ethics. It's not really uncommon. We all sort of have, free-floating, unjustified suppositions. And here, that you shouldn't harm other people is just this. Why is it wrong to, I guess here, I'll put it this way. If there's no objective moral truths, right, why would it be wrong to hurt other people in all circumstances? It's something people struggle to articulate, right? Because it's just wrong, because, you shouldn't do it, not because there's some kind of objective moral fact behind it. And it's just kind of common sense, right? Okay, so I'll say very quickly before I move on, this type of ethics, right, in a lot of senses is a sort of utilitarian ethics. Moral consequentialism is a form of utilitarian ethics. And you could contrast this with other forms of ethics that other kind of ethical systems will propagate. Things like, virtue ethics. So why is an action moral in a virtue-based system would be because doing it improves you as a person, right? And builds virtue in you, right? And so you become moral by doing things that are virtuous, right? You build virtue over time. You sometimes have duty-based ethics. And this is most often, right, especially in Western culture, in relation to like a deity, God, right? Well, why should you do something? Because you have a duty to, the deity, sometimes to, family or group. You have certain duties based on, birth or clan or, tribe or nation or whatever. Those are duty-based ethics. And then there are, there's deontological, which lots of people like, which is basically, there are just sort of objective moral facts that exist in nature. And you should just do the right things because they are the right things. And they bring about good results, right? But that's not our millennials. Our millennials are moral consequentialists. They care about the results. And so, it might not be wrong to steal. It might not be wrong, to cheat if, the results don't hurt anyone else. All right. you get some really interesting rationalizations out of this, right? Like, I can steal from this store because they have insurance. So they're going to be made whole, right? Like, they're going to make an insurance claim, and they're going to, the insurance is going to pay them back for the thing I stole. So really, nothing bad is going to happen to anyone. I get the thing I want, and they get made whole at the end of the day. So there's some really weird stuff when you get into consequentialist ethics. Okay, now some of the people they interviewed would refer to things like karma as being important, and this is usually like a notion that what goes around comes around. It's not. I guess it's not really like the Hindu or Buddhist kind of notion of karma in a religious sense. It's a sense that somehow, and again, this is a sort of weird free-floating assumption, that the world balances itself out. Oh, what was I watching the other day? I think I was watching Cobra Kai, and I thought of this, right? Because when you're an academic, you have weird thoughts. This is the kind of thing that there's this one scene where one character's like, "Put good out in world, good things come back," right? And that's a kind of very millennial pop culture sort of way of understanding karma, right? What goes around comes around, and if you do kind things, kind things will come back to you. Sort of ignoring the fact that some of the most awful people in the world somehow always seem to win. I'm not going to say Donald Trump, but there I just did. All right. So, again, a feature of being postmodern in your ethics is, an abiding relativism. So, millennials have a moral perspective that is deeply relativistic, right? What is right? What is right versus what's wrong? A really common phrase that they heard was, "Well, everybody is different, but for me, this is right. But someone else, something else might be right or wrong." And a thought that nobody can impose or presume the perspective of another person. So in a sense, you can't really make moral claims for another person. They are basically very much just related to you. All right, and every individual is different, and each individual has to decide, for themselves on what they think is moral. So you have a sort of breakdown of shared moral codes, right? I'm not going to say Durkheim predicted this, but Durkheim 100% predicted this, right? Durkheim, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, and his concerns about anomie and what would happen with industrialization and as people moved out of the medieval village and stopped sharing as much of their lives, right? Durkheim 100%. I'm going to give Durkheim an A+ for that prediction. Good job, Emil. Okay, I'm sure Durkheim very much needs my approval, given that he's been dead for over a century. Okay, so, how much more do I have on my millennials? A couple more slides, and then maybe we'll pause before we talk Gen Z. Okay, so generally by emerging adulthood, again through high school and school and high school, they were similar, I think, to Gen Xers, where there was a sort of low grade, kind of derision aimed at gay and lesbian people. I think hopefully this is less the case. Very common slur, amongst millennials when they were young was to say that something was gay, as a form of derision. That sort of starts to peter out by the time they hit emerging adulthood, right? As they become more aware of, gay and lesbian people they're friends with, and among them, they become more kind of open-minded and tolerant, and they embrace kind of, gay and lesbian people in major ways. And this will carry through later, right, with bisexual, transgender, and the whole kind of panoply of identities in the LGBTQ movement, but it really starts, again, with gays and lesbians. Okay. They are pretty liberal on the use of substances. You would probably call their ethics when it comes to, substance use on the whole libertarian, right? You do you. As long as it doesn't affect me, we're all good. Should be an A. libertarian. Okay. And because they became sexually active, right, at a relatively young age, they thought that this made them more liberal and open-minded, right, especially around questions of sexual ethics. So, pretty open on that stuff. Okay. So, they are also, broadly speaking, and again, despite never having read eminent researchers or sociologists like Peter Berger, and his social construction of reality, which is a great book. You should all read it. It's great. They've never read Peter Berger and the social construction of reality, and yet, which he co-authors with Thomas Luckman, they all tend to believe that the social world is changeable and historically contingent, right? Or, as it's typically said, that things are socially constructed, right? So things like gender norms, right? Race, ethnicity, right? They will view all of these things as socially constructed. So this is pretty deeply ingrained in millennials, that all of these sort of institutions of the past are results of, past social forces that shape things in particular way. Okay, so, and their morality and kind of their thought in general comes to be framed in terms of subjective and emotional terms, right? So instead of I think or I believe, not so much with the millennials, the phrase is I feel that. And I catch myself saying I feel all the time. And I'm like, oh, why does anyone care what I feel? They should think about, what I believe. And I remember getting that on a course evaluation, because I was talking to a student and they hadn't done as well on the short answer section of a test. And I think I kept saying, like, when I read your answer, I felt like duh, instead of like, this is what was missing from your answer. So I was framing it within the terms of my subjective emotions, even though I was telling them the same thing. And they were like, it seemed like, it was just all about his feelings and not so much about objective standards. And it's just a weird, I think, millennial way of phrasing things. We talk a lot in I feel statements. Okay. Almost done. Oh, yeah. Okay, we're almost done, I swear. Okay, education. Again, as they're in emerging adulthood, uncertain about the purpose of life, but, and again, we see this, and if you remember with Gen X, right? We talked about Gen X, right, in terms of, they had moved from, what was it? The point of life was not so much to develop a meaningful philosophy, but, to get wealthy, right? To be financially well off. This is kind of the outflow of this, right? And we see this a little bit with Gen X as well, is whereas maybe like the silence and the baby boomers, to an extent, thought about education in terms of bettering yourself, right? Coming up with a meaningful philosophy of life, connecting yourself with kind of the tradition of your culture and society. For Gen X, I think this starts with Gen X, right? We see it with millennials as well, is education is no longer about that, right? The value of education isn't that. It's about getting a credential so that you can get a job, right? It's, and again, it's a kind of weird generational shift, but the credential is just basically there to help you get a job, right? It's not about anything else. The university isn't about learning Greek and Latin and Shakespeare and understanding history or any of that. It's just, I need a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science or an engineering degree so I can get that job so I can be financially well off. Okay. And then drugs, which are good, which are bad. Ask your mom or ask your dad. Sorry. info or the public service announcements of the 90s have been drilled into my brain. In what way? Okay, yeah. I mean, clearly the public service announcements of the 80s and 90s didn't work particularly well. Millennials consumed a lot of drugs, mostly marijuana. But by kind of emerging adulthood, most of them, had desisted from frequent drug use, and it remains only a small cohort that continues to consume marijuana, and an even smaller one that moves into hard drugs. I don't know why there's a circle there. I need to fix that. Okay. And then I think I have 4 slides left for the millennials. I'm sorry. Apparently I just like talking about myself. Okay, so and then we'll take a break. We'll do 4 more slides and we'll take a little break. When it comes to the millennials, settling down. When do you settle down? Well, not now, right? Not when you're young. It is for later. And we'll talk about this when we get into families. But we see a shift here to thinking of, marriage or serious relationships as a capstone, right? Rather than, versus a foundation. So we talked about foundation. We talked about, our silence, right? It's not a foundation anymore. It's a capstone, right? So something that you stick on top of the structure of your life. So the average age of marriage steadily climbed for millennials, right? It's continuing as they get, as you move through the cohort, it gets later and later. And then now that we're in, Gen Z, again, we're seeing that age creep into the 30s. And what is youth? Youth is a time to try things, find your passion, travel, secure yourself as an individual, and own, and do things like, get your career, your home set, your stable income before you even think of settling down. It's a very normal cultural way of thinking. This one I think is interesting because it is a shift, and we'll talk about it again when we get to the unit on sex and intimacy. The millennials are really the generation that pioneers, hookup culture or hookups. And it's related to this, right? We'll talk about that again when we talk about sex and intimacy. But if you're thinking that relationships are for later in life, once you've got things set, how does it? Donna Freitas puts it in a particular way. And again, you'll meet her later in the course. Sex and especially experiencing things sexually becomes part of like your youth experience. But it's almost like the equivalent of a checkbox, right? Something that you do because you want to experience, the things that are part of adulthood. So it's like, okay, did the laundry, check, paid bills, check, hooked up with someone, check, right? And this is the kind of way that millennials kind of think of it. So millennials tend to display a kind of, preference for detached relationships in their emerging adult years. This fades as they get into their late 20s and 30s, right? And people start to become more relationship minded. But in those teen and emerging adult years, it's very detached, right? It goes through various phases, and it has been described as kind of confusing, right? So you go, your friends, you're hanging out, you're dating, or friends with benefits, semi-cohabiting, cohabiting, living apart together, right? There's all sorts of terms that get generated to describe these amorphous relationships, because it shifts around and things are, very undefined and unsettled for a lot of these relationships. You get terms like define the relationship talk, as people try to figure out where the heck they are in relationships. Okay, and hooking up is common, and we'll talk about it later again, but hooking up is defined in various ways, but tends to be very broadly defined. Any kind of physical contact, right? Kissing all the way to sexual intercourse can all be called a hookup. All right. Well, again, we'll talk about this as we go further into the course. Most millennials, having experienced, I think, the effects of the divorce of the boomers and Gen Xers, tend to see marriage as a kind of a risky proposition in a lot of cases, and they want a kind of buffer. There's other things going on as well. especially for women. There's an increasing sense that men suck, right? That they're not very good. We could put this as a question of marriageability. Women start to evaluate men's marriageability, or their prospect for being in a relationship with men in sort of different ways. And there's a lot of reasons. Again, we'll talk about it as we go through. Men on the whole tend to become a little bit less desirable for women to form long-term relationships with, so cohabiting becomes a kind of buffer. Okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. For men, especially, what you might call high status men, because they are, a minority of men, cohabitation becomes a sort of stalling tactic, right? For a lot of them, where, they want to be in relationships, but they don't want to commit before they've had a chance to sort of see what's available in the field, or in the, I guess, let's say in the marriage market or in the dating market. So cohabiting tends to give them, marriage market. Cohabiting tends to give them a way to sort of delay entry into marriage as they continue to evaluate potential partners. But we'll talk about this again as we go forward. But yeah, there's a real desire for both men and women, but for different reasons, to mitigate some of the possible risks that come with relationships. Living with someone means, test driving the relationship, but also, especially for higher status men, delaying, a really deep commitment to one particular person for longer, or as long as possible in some cases. Okay, I think I've got two more, and I can finish up. Oh, maybe we'll skip that question. Yeah, we'll skip that one. Here I was. Okay. In terms of kind of their beliefs of what the good life is, it's consumer culture, and it's consuming things, owning things, taking vacations, and all of the things that probably they associate with the boomers. And from a moral perspective, right, as long as you can afford your purchases, you're totally entitled to buy whatever you want. So they don't have a really strong sense of, say, like the common good, or that your economic activity is somehow related potentially to social problems that other people have, right? As long as you can afford to buy what you buy, you should be okay. A minority position is a little bit more aware, right, that we should take care of each other. But like relationships, right, and this is also an interesting one, like relationships, things like volunteering, donating, and helping people is something they view themselves as doing later in life. Typically, and here's the kicker, and here's where, for civic life, the millennials are a bit of a disaster when they retire, right? So there's this idea that they're going to volunteer and help with society once they're retired, right? So they're waiting a full 45 years from where they are, when they're saying this. Most of them want a sort of middle-class lifestyle. That's kind of what they're interested in. Okay, last couple slides. They're cynical about public life, right? Most millennials don't think it's actually possible to transform the world in very serious ways. They tend to think that society and its norms are socially constructed. They don't think it's possible to change those norms. And what they suggest is very few millennials at this point in their lives were intellectually engaged in any of the major cultural or ethical debates, right? Whether it be things like climate change or racial justice, right? None of them had a vision of the common good. And the idea that, you have duties to your country was not something that they kind of thought about. That citizenship comes with duties was not a kind of millennial notion. And most of them were just deeply engaged in their private lives, and were working on trying to be happy. Okay. Let's pause here. I'm going to pause here. Okay, so we're going to pause. We'll pick up here in, what time is it? 40 So let's say at like 2:55, and we'll try and we'll clean off Gen Z and maybe get started on education today if we have time. So yeah, let's say okay. Let's say 2:55. We'll say 2:55. We'll come back. I'm gonna go freshen my drink, and we'll go from there. All right. Don't steal my broken minivan key. What are you guys here? I don't need to take you. Alrighty, I think I'm back on. I think the battery died. Hang on. Haha. Okay. I'm sorry. My microphone. Sorry, friends. My little clip-on mic died. I'm very sorry. Okay. We're going to pick up here, but I will try to answer your questions. All right. I'm curious. Again, I quiz you. At what age, when did you get your driver's license? If you have gotten it at all. And you'll see that if I scroll down, do not have license is a possibility. So, fully half of you. Oh no. So it appears either you got your license at 16 or you don't have your license at all. And there's no ambiguous position between the two. No, obviously there's a small sub cohort that got it at 17, 18, and 20. But, you know, as you see, better than a third of your classmates do not in fact have a driver's license. Oh, it went down a little bit. All right, we're gonna move on before the point gets undermined. Okay. My voice modulating device. I am sorry. Hang on. It's not my fault. My microphone died. Okay. Yes. I tried to turn the microphone back on, but it died. Okay. SULALCSA. Okay. I don't remember what I wrote there. Oh, sorry. Short childhood. SC, long adolescence. Gen Z is long childhood, short adolescence. Okay. I don't know if I don't want to redo all of these slides. Sorry. If you're here, it doesn't matter if the microphone works. Okay, the Netflix effect is, you know, you don't do fun adulty type things outside of the house because you're too busy watching Netflix at home. That's what the Netflix effect is. Okay. People started talking about the Netflix effect initially in terms of falling birth rates because people were theorizing that, how to put it, people weren't having sex because, you know, watching that new show on Netflix was easier and more entertaining. So, you know, we'll talk about that later too. But I think there's actually something to that. Okay, so more on Gen Z and gender. Maybe I should actually, I'm going to go back really quickly here. What do we see here, just in terms of these charts, right? Percentage of US adults identifying as transgender and percent identifying as non-binary by generation. So what do we see, right? In terms of trans, right, not surprisingly, the boomers are very low. A little bit of a rise for, you know, Gen X and millennials. But obviously, and again, the scale here is small, right? You're still, you know, sub 3%. But many more as a percentage of the cohort of your Gen Z youth identify as transgender. Same with non-binary, right? It's the same thing here. The most likely to identify as non-binary are Gen Z. And this bottom one, percent of US adults who believe there's more than two genders by generation. And you can kind of see the change over time. These three cohorts haven't changed a whole lot. Gen Z was more accepting to begin with of the idea that there's more than two genders. And they jumped up, you know, from 2020 to 2021. Okay, I already did that. Okay, so the percentage of those identifying as transgender has increased the most, and this is a kind of interesting and weird quirk, and please don't ask me to explain it because I have no idea why, has increased most amongst those assigned female at birth, though it has increased amongst those assigned male at birth too. And what you see here is a sort of weird inversion of kind of the typical pattern, right? If you go back to, the boomers, many more people, assigned male at birth who identify as female. Same thing, with Gen X. It sort of is roughly even for millennials. With Gen Z, assigned female at birth kind of zooms ahead of those, or transgender who say they're assigned male at birth. Yes, I can work with these terms. They're a bit of a tongue twister. That is all. Okay. Same thing here, right? Percent of U.S. adults identifying as non-binary. Again, they're small percentages overall, but you see many more people who are, assigned female at birth in that Gen Z cohort identifying as non-binary. Though again, males identifying or assigned male at birth identifying as non-binary jumped a lot there as well. And then percent of U.S. adults identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual by generation. And here, now we're talking a bigger, like a much bigger kind of scale. Oh, I can't walk away from the microphone because the microphone's on my laptop now. Sorry, people not here. What you see, right, is you saw a big jump. These numbers aren't crazy different, right? A little bit more in terms of people identifying as gay and lesbian in Gen Z. Male bisexual took a big leap as well over previous generations, but female bisexual absolutely exploded in this generational cohort. And again, I don't have a great explanation for this. It's actually just a sort of, social fact that, I think at this moment, I don't know that anyone has a great answer for why this has happened. Okay, so we've seen kind of jumps in all of these identities, right, from generation to generation. Now, I think what's interesting is this seems to be a pretty unified effect. It's increased across rural-urban divides, right? So it's not just happening, you might hear some like online pundits suggesting that this is a phenomenon that happens in, liberal coastal cities, right? But it's really not. It's something that's jumped across the board, urban, rural. You're seeing similar things. All of these things have sort of jumped up all at the same time in Gen Z. So there's definitely a different thinking on gender identity and sexuality that's going on, the cause of which I think remains relatively unexplained. Okay. Ooh, another quiz for you. I think this is the last one. I'm sorry. All right, marriage and family are extremely important. What do you say? All right, everybody agrees. Good. Oh, hang on. No, everybody just agrees. See how close you are to the statistics. No one disagrees so far. My winter class had a lot more disagreement. I think it was a solid 17% of people disagree. Oh, there's one. Okay, good. I'm happy. No, I don't know. It's just a number. Okay, let's have a look and see how similar you are to your cohort. All right, so marriage, long-term relationships, and children. Oops, that should be Gen Z, sorry. Gen Z. I wrote millennials because I clearly have myself on my mind. Marriage, long-term relationships, and children are all things that Gen Z think are for much later, like much, much later. And they have the lowest birth rates for teens and early 20s ever recorded. And it's funny because I used to use a textbook for this class called Youth and Society, The Long and Winding Road, authored by Vapu Tiska. And I think I was probably one of the biggest users of it, because I think this is probably one of the biggest sociology of youth courses in the country, because we run, 240 students through sociology of youth a year, roughly. So when it came time for the publisher, they're redoing the book now. I don't use it anymore because it had been published in 2014 and it was really outdated. But one of the things that they said is they sent me the to review the manuscript, and in the chapter on sex and intimacy, they were still talking about teen pregnancy, and I was like, nah, you can't, like, it's not even an interesting question anymore, because when we talk about Gen Z, right, their birth rate for teenagers is next to nothing, right? It's like a blip compared to what it was for Gen X. So I thought that was kind of outdated. So I said, they needed to change that. I have power. That's what I'm telling you. Okay, so what do we see in terms of, percent of U.S. 12th graders with certain marriage and family goals? What do we see, right? Well, it's obviously changed a little bit. Now, most of them still say that marriage and family is extremely important, right? So they're not all that dissimilar from you, right? So between strongly agree and strongly disagree, right, you are at, 76%? So you are, oh, come on. Still voting? Oh, come on. That's funny. Okay. Right, and that's, a little bit more than these numbers coming out of Monitoring the Future, right, where they had it somewhere around 67, 68%, right, of young people saying that, or Gen Z youth saying that marriage and family is extremely important. However, right, what you see is not far fewer of them, somewhat fewer of them, think they are likely to get married, and somewhat fewer of them prefer to have a romantic partner, right? Prefer to be with someone, right? That number is trending downward. Okay, so kind of different things. Okay, and this rather, I would say, troubling slide. Percentage of Gen Z reporting that they are unhappy. And we see, again, 20%, in a sense, isn't the end of the world, right? You're still talking about around a fifth, maybe about a quarter of them, of a generational cohort saying they are unhappy, which means either you have, 4/5 or 3/4 who don't say that. So it's not, I don't want to overplay it. However, New Zealand. I don't know if I ever noticed this. In 2005, 2009, in New Zealand, no young people were saying they were unhappy. Everybody was just amazingly happy to be in New Zealand. Man, I want to move to New Zealand now. And I mean, they're still kind of lagging behind the other three, right? 0. Smiley face. That's a good number. But what we see is kind of broadly a really quick rise in terms of the number of young people who say they are unhappy, right? So up here, right, this is obviously a relatively troubling set of numbers, and it's risen really quickly from, if we go back, where's Canada? So Australia's here. Australians are apparently much more miserable than New Zealanders. Explain that one to me. It was about 3% in Australia, 3-4% in Australia in 1994 to 1998 of young people saying they're unhappy, right? And now you're above 20%. In Canada, right, we were about the same, maybe about 3%, and we've jumped up well, above our even American confreres. We're trending on to 25% of young people saying they're unhappy, which is not a good number. And then the Americans are kind of in there. They were pretty, up and down and kind of low here, and it jumped up really sharply. So something has kind of changed, right? These are referred to often as, this kind of shape, especially the American one. But that New Zealand one, these are hockey shape or hockey stick graphs. And usually when you have a hockey stick shape to a graph, that means something has changed drastically, right? Because usually social trends kind of bump along. They go like this, and they go down, and they go up, and they go down, right? And this is a relatively long timeline, but what you see is a sort of sharp turn upward for most of these numbers. And that, I think, is concerning. Okay. Pessimism. So, yeah, the millennials were optimistic. Gen Z is pretty pessimistic. So these are American numbers, obviously. 6 in 10 Gen Zers, right? So you're in a clear majority there of Gen Zers disagree with the statement that America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead. Okay, that itself is a kind of concerning number. Because obviously, if you think that, you're not too optimistic about your own society. 3/4 of Gen Zers, right, 3 out of 4, think we should tear society down and start again. That's really concerning. Why is this concerning to me? This sounds to me like pre-revolutionary Russia, right, or pre-revolutionary France, where, you know, people like me get guillotined, and I don't want to be guillotined. Please don't guillotine me. That'd be great. If you could just spare me based on my rate my professor score alone, that would just be lovely. If we could only guillotine the professors with a 3.5 or lower, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Okay. I'm down with this. No, I'm kidding. But those are, like, honestly, like, if you look at the kind of history, this kind of dissatisfaction with society is like revolutionary problems, kind of worrisome. Okay. In the US, 4 out of 10 Zoomers, right? This is the other name. I actually like this better than Gen Z. I should start using it all the time. Zoomers believe that the US founders, right, were better described as villains than heroes. And we don't have an equivalent Canadian number, but I suspect it would be like this or higher, right? So again, this is 4 out of 10. It's a minority position, but it's a substantial minority, right? It's definitely a plurality. And this suggests, right, a kind of disfavor with, you know, the kind of founding mythology of your country, which again puts you at odds with the country in general. Only 36% said they were very or extremely proud to be American. You know, I imagine this number's probably gone down recently for reasons I can't begin to speculate on. Also more negative about capitalism. Only a slim majority have a positive view of capitalism, and they tend to perceive discrimination and an external locus of control. Okay, explain this one really quickly, right? So things like, I don't have a graph for external locus of control, but I think this is interesting, right? Let's take a look at this, and I'll talk about external locus of control. The founders as villains, right? You see a big generational difference, right? Very few of, obviously, your silents or boomers think that, and it kind of rises generationally. America's an unfair society. You don't really cross, you know, a plurality of that, a majority of that until you reach the millennials, but then Gen Z, you know, even higher than the millennials, and significant change is needed. I guess that's slightly less revolutionary than murder everyone. You know, again, it's been rising. Your silents and your boomers the least likely to say that, and then Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z all more likely. And these are all generations that have benefited less than the boomers, for sure. You know, hard to have hope for the future. You see that one, you know, kind of bottoms out, and wonder if purpose to life given the situation, right? So it tanks out, hard to have hope for the world, tanks out somewhere in the early 2000s, and then it sort of climbs from there, right? So people get more pessimistic over time. And what's my bottom one? I keep forgetting I can't walk away from the laptop because my microphone died. Expect a professional job, expect a graduate or professional degree, or expect to own more than parents, right? All of these things have declined a little bit. So we're talking about, you know, generally a pessimistic generation. We talk about Gen Z. Could COVID contribute to the sudden rise in unhappiness? That is, for a second there, I thought that was a poll that I had started, because that's what we've been doing. That's an interesting question. Could COVID contribute to the sudden rise in unhappiness? Yes, definitely. COVID was a big shock to the system. It definitely screwed a lot of things up and potentially exacerbated a lot of trends. Now, I think what will happen in the course is as we get later, again, I'm promising you things that I don't want to talk about right now. I want to talk about them at some other point. Mental health, like some of these mental health problems, right? They start to increase long before COVID. COVID makes them worse, but it's not the cause, right? And certainly, now we're 3-4 years beyond kind of the worst part of COVID. We should start to see a recovery. And if you look at the more recent numbers, we haven't, right? These trends are continuing kind of in a similar direction. So I think COVID could explain some, but definitely not all of what has happened, right? And I mean, if we go back to this chart, COVID doesn't really hit until here, right? So these numbers, you're actually talking, these are pre-COVID numbers, right? Because you're ending in 2020. So the trend starts long before COVID, right? And gets considerably worse. So all of this stuff predates COVID by quite a bit. And, it's continuing past kind of the worst effects of COVID for quite a while. Okay. Love the question, though. Okay. Oh, I'm done. That was my last slide. Gen Z got way less than they deserved. Okay, I'm going to switch slideshows. Education. Okay. Okay, it looks like that's there. Perfect. I love this laptop. It works well. Oops. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about education. We got about like 14 minutes left. We'll use as much as we can and get started, and then finish this on Wednesday. Wednesday, at the end of the class, I will talk about the exam, which is the following Wednesday, right? Because we have class on Wednesday, and then we have a long weekend. We don't have class on the Victoria Day Monday, obviously. And then Wednesday, you're going to come back, and the exam is that day. We'll do half a class that day, and I will hang out here in case you have exam questions. So, I'm going to talk about education a little bit. I think I've been failing to unify my Slidos. I need to go back through and fix all of this, but I will do that at a later date. Okay, so education, right? Education obviously is really, really important. And as we move through our generational cohorts, it has become more and more important because the economy has gotten more and more complex, and you need more education in order to really get ahead in the economy. So when we talk about young people, right, basically this period from 5 years old to probably when you're 22 or 23, your primary occupation, the thing you're going to spend most of your life doing, is school, right? Whether, elementary, middle school, secondary school, or, university, or some other form of post-secondary education. Now, I think the kind of norm is, and if we look at the data, for for the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, the very minimum kind of level of education that most people get is a secondary education, right? So high school. Rates of, high school dropouts have been declining generation to generation. Principally, I think for economic reasons, you simply cannot get ahead anymore with less than a high school diploma. And even a high school diploma today is getting you way less than it used to. Okay, now that said, graduating from high school is still seen as one of life's major transitional moments. And this is, I think for me, as I think about this is very much a hangover of, the silence, but even more so the baby boomers. Because, for relatively big parts of those cohorts, high school was the end of education, right? Like the last step. You got your high school diploma, and that equipped you with enough education to thrive in the marketplace, right? To actually, get a good job, put food on the table, support a family, and all of that stuff. So for a lot of people, that's as far as they went. For millennial, for Gen X is kind of in the middle, but certainly for millennials and Gen Z, I'm going to put Gen X in the middle because I said the middle. For Gen Z or the Zoomers, I always kind of joke, high school graduation. Congratulations, you graduated from high school. Guess what you get to do now? More school, right? And increasingly considerably more school, right? We're talking, 4 to 6 years kind of being relatively normal after high school today. But we still treat the graduation from high school as a big life event, right? And yeah, school remains one of our major sites of secondary socialization. Okay, so education in Canada and the US has a sort of somewhat checkered history. Until relatively recently, Canada was a laggard in terms of international educational achievement, right? In the 90s, Canada and the US lagged way behind European countries in terms of scores in reading, math, and science on what's called the PISA test, which is the Program of International Student Achievement, which is this big international test they do every 2 years, and they kind of rank countries in terms of how well they're doing. Canada, so the US is still Canada and the US were in the 20s, right, in the mid-20s in the 1990s. Not too great. The US is still kind of in the mid to low 20s today. We can nuance that a little bit. Canada has risen in these standings, right, and I think they topped out in 2010 when Canada sort of hit 5th in science, 6th in math, and 2nd in reading scores, right, surpassing, some traditionally high countries like Finland, Singapore, I forget, South Korea always has relatively high scores. Broadly, this was a result of changes in curricula and teaching methods in the 90s. Started in Alberta. Alberta reformed its education system in the 1990s, brought it, to the point where it was sort of a world-leading and world-beating education system, which it's been running down ever since. But kind of dragged the country up, and then Ontario kind of copied Alberta's reforms in the 2000s, and the whole country kind of surged ahead, so that by 2010, Canada was really high in the rankings. It has slipped in the past few years, right? I haven't seen the 2024 numbers, but the 2022 numbers, Canada was kind of, teetering on the edge of the top 10, kind of ready to fall out. The US, typically is seen as having a pretty poor education system because it still scores about mid-20s in terms of its overall education system. Now, I do want to nuance that a little bit because there are it's a big kind of a weird country. How to put this? I mean, basically, the U.S. is roughly a little bit smaller than the European Union, and it has as much diversity in terms of its systems as the EU. So if you took, say, Massachusetts, if you took its education system and split it out from the rest of the world, Massachusetts, any guesses where Massachusetts would be in the world? Number one. Massachusetts has some amazing schools and an amazing education system. Any guesses where Alabama would be? Right? 45th. So, and if you look at Mississippi's down in the low 30s or the high 30s. Lots of other states are kind of middling. California, which used to be world beating, has fallen into like the 30s as well. California has a lot of problems with its education system. So, lots of things in the US. I always find it interesting. I read this book a few years ago, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way. And one of the facts that always stuck with me, do you want to know the average salary of a high school football coach in Alabama? It's about $600,000. So that, they might also teach like geography or history or something, but really they're there to be the high school football coach. And because in some of those southern states, high school football is such a big deal, it is an industry all in and of itself. You have some coaches, and there were some coaches that made as much as $2.5 million at the really prestigious and high value high schools. The high school football coach made more money than the rest of the faculty put together. So there are issues with the American education system, and there's a reason that Alabama is really, really low. High school football is a big deal, and it kind of sucks up a lot of the other funding. Okay, so good times. Just making sure everyone can still hear me. Okay, dropping out, right? Like I said, dropout rates have been falling, decade on decade, generational cohort over generational cohort for a really long time. One thing that, how am I doing? Oh, I have 5 minutes left. We're going to talk, we'll talk for 5 more minutes. Okay, dropout rates, though, when they do exist, they correlate really closely with two things: social class and gender. There's also macroeconomic questions, right? So social class, if you're poor or working class, you're more likely to drop out, especially if your family's in financial difficulty and you need to help. And gender, males are slightly more likely to drop out than females. Okay, there are some macroeconomic questions that play here as well. So, generally speaking, the hotter an economy is, right? So a hot economy tends to equal, higher entry-level wages. Because if an economy is really hot, or even, in a state of overheating, sometimes you get economies that are too hot, what'll tend to happen is companies just are looking for workers. So they lower standards. If you just need a warm body, right, maybe you can train that person on the job. You might have to invest more money into training them, but at least you have a person to train. So when you have higher entry-level wages, right, and a hotter economy tends to lead to higher entry-level wages and lower standards, which means more people will make the economic calculus to leave school to work. Right? Pretty simple math, right? So hot economy plus high entry-level wages and low standards means more people leave work, right? So if you get periods of like extreme economic overheating, and if you go back to 2013 in Alberta, oil was somewhere over $100 per barrel. So the Alberta economy, are there two L's in barrel? I don't remember. Yes, I'm pretty sure there are. I'm going to go with yes. Okay, so there was, can't walk away from my laptop. A very overheated economy, right? Meaning that basically you could make a lot of money even dropping out of high school in the oil patch. And it led to something around a 25% dropout rate, even higher amongst men, right? So what ended up happening is the Alberta government then invested a whole bunch of money in don't drop out campaigns. But then in 2015, the price of oil dropped precipitously into like the $40 range, and that problem sort of solved itself because the economic calculus didn't kind of play out. All right, lower socioeconomic class plays a direct role in dropping out, right? If your future economic prospects look better than what you could get now by dropping out, you're not going to drop out. So if it looks like you might as well get your money now because this is probably as good as you're going to get, people will tend to drop out. And then, obviously other groups, First Nations and other Indigenous tend to drop out at higher rates. There's other things at play there. And in immigrant groups generally have really low dropout rates, especially Southeast Asian immigrants and Asian immigrants have very, very low dropout rates in the single digits. Okay, and as I said, men slightly more likely than women to drop out. We'll start here because I'm out of time. All right, thank you. We will pick this up for putting up with my long tirade about millennials. We'll pick this up on Wednesday. We'll finish up education. We'll talk about your exam. I'll show you some examples. I will explain to you very carefully how it's going to work, and we will go from there. Okay. Oh. Now I will turn off the recording, and I will remember to properly check that my microphone is charging for now.